Good evening and welcome to the Bexar County Commissioners Court Precinct 1 Candidate Forum, presented by the League of Women Voters. I'm TJ Mays, host of KLRN's On the Record. We are pleased to have you joining us tonight for this special presentation. 2020 is a critical time for Bexar County, and we have a number of pressing issues. We are honored to host this evening's forum featuring two candidates, Democratic candidate Rebecca Clay Flores and Republican candidate Gabriel Lara. I would like to thank both candidates for being here and their willingness to address these critical issues. Now let us begin by highlighting the format of the forum. The questions have been created by the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan organization that does not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Both candidates will have 2 minutes to give their opening statements. I will ask each candidate the same questions. Both candidates will have approximately 1 minute to respond to each question, and candidates will have a 30-second rebuttal if necessary. A coin toss took place just before the start of the event to determine which candidate would give the first opening statement. That same candidate will be asked the first question, and we will rotate subsequent questions until the end of the forum. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Lara, you won the coin toss. Your opening statement, please.
Sure. Thank you all for having us here. My name is Gabriel Lara, born and raised on the south side of San Antonio. I attended Harlandale High School and St. Philip's College. My 6 sisters and 3 brothers learned early on about the value of work, because once you turn 12, you're old enough to work the strawberry fields in Northern California or pick cotton down in South Texas. So growing up, we had a few challenges along the way, but we survived. We had a beautiful mom and dad. Currently, I'm raising, my wife and I of 22 years are raising a 14-year-old daughter, a 12-year-old son, and we also look after a 13-year-old granddaughter at homeschool while her mother goes to work to teach. I've been blessed with a career saving lives that has spanned almost 40 years. 4.5 of those were with the U.S. Navy as a Navy medic, and 34 years with the City of San Antonio Fire Department. I spent those 34 years up and down the streets of Precinct 1, where I saw the despair of many people and felt that something, even though I've been retired 7 years, felt that something needed to be done. So I'm thinking that we should bring back and have quality health care in some of the undeserved areas of the county. We also need to focus on the infrastructure on the growing areas of the county that have been underserved. We also need to bring or have the manpower, the training, education for our law enforcement officials and our emergency service districts. We need to work with our state lawmakers on property tax relief, especially for our seniors. And we need to have prepare a workforce. And that workforce needs to start at the high school level with work-study programs, something that we have access to in the terms of SANYO and DE. So I'm asking to once again have an opportunity to serve you, and I humbly ask for your support.
All right, opening statement, Rebecca Clay Flores.
Hi, well, first of all, I really want to thank PBS and League of Women Voters. You guys are really two entities that have always, that we can always rely on to educate the community in terms of who we need to vote for and what the real issues are. So thanks so much for having me. I'm Rebecca Clay Flores, grew up here in San Antonio. My early childhood, my 2 older brothers and I were spent homeless. Grew up in poverty here. My father's African American and my mom's from Mexico. I actually hold dual citizenship with Mexico and speak Spanish fluently. And every summer, my mom would take my brothers and I back to Mexico to do community service work. So that really was my foundation. It was my saving grace to really understand poverty, even though we were the poorest of the poor in this country. It helped me to be appreciative of everything that we had here. And my mother really instilled in us that there were 2 free things in this country that no one can ever take away from us. That was my freedom of religion, so my faith, and free public schools. So I loved my inner city neighborhood schools, proud graduate of Breckenridge High School. Then I went on to Princeton, majored in religion and African American studies, got a master's in education from Harvard, and have spent 15 years in teaching and nonprofit work. I have taught from 10-year-olds to 60-year-olds. I also taught GED and ESL. I've taught at university level in Mexico and out of state. And through that time have also traveled to about 20 countries. And the last 5 years I've worked for the mayor's office and currently for Metro Health, which has been an interesting experience, obviously, with COVID. And I was basically just really tired of seeing our part of town being left behind, and was really disgusted that in 100 years there have only been 2 female county commissioners and never been a woman of color. So instead of complaining, I thought I'd do something about it, and coming off a really big win against the 16-year incumbent. So I'm just really excited to be here and hope to serve as county commissioner for Precinct 1 and really fight for some resources for our community.
All right, now we're on to the question segment of the forum. What new ideas, Mr. Lauda, would you offer that haven't been heard before if you were elected to the county commission?
I haven't been heard. First of all, we need a full-time county commissioner. That's unheard of in this county. The second thing is, it's been kind of heard of but not expanded on. Commissioner Elizondo, he had this plan to expand healthcare, but we need to expand that healthcare to other areas, including the south and the west side. I think it's time for a new medical center. It's time for a new medical center, and I think Port SA would be the ideal place for it. Something that people are not going to agree with me, but I think we need a rail system similar like Denver's. We're growing, and it's not going to stop. And we're not always going to have the gasoline, and as long as we have cars traveling up and down the streets, we are going to have a problem with air pollution. So those are 2 ideas that we haven't heard of that I think we definitely need to address.
Ms. Flores, if you win the election, what would you say are fresh ideas that you'd bring to the Commissioner's Court?
So there's several, but one of the main things I really want to focus on is educating the community. I consider myself a community educator, and hopefully when I win on November 3rd, I'm not going to be just another politician, but I'll continue to be a community educator. So I really want to partner with social service organizations and the business community and bring free community education courses throughout Precinct 1. So these would look like in the form of seminars. So for example, when I spoke to the San Antonio Board of Realtors, to have free community seminars on the pros and cons of buying a home, how to protest your property taxes, things of that nature that really educate the community in terms of how they can be engaged in their own politics and not just wait for an elected official, whether they're good or bad, to get the job done. So I really want to instill that in a whole bunch of different levels throughout Precinct 1.
So we just had a budget. The Commissioner's Court adopted it on Tuesday. There's a pilot program in the budget that included $1.5 million that would send trained mental health professionals and EMT crews to certain 911 calls instead of law enforcement officers. Do you support this plan, and would you support similar reforms?
Yes, I absolutely support this plan. So for the last 3 years, I didn't do it this year because of campaigning, but for the last 3 years, I've been on the steering committee of the Center for Healthcare Services annual planning for their free mental health conference. And so there is some training already for some of our law enforcement, but it's not enough. So we definitely need to have more law enforcement trainings and more partnerships. I'm a huge proponent of interlocal agreements between the city and the county so we can better use our resources. So mental health is a big part of my platform, and it's a shame that we have to have these kind of situations and we have to have deaths to finally get a wake-up call to do it. So it's something I definitely support. It's something that I will be watching closely, because it's one thing to propose something in the budget and pass something. It's another thing to implement it and make sure that we are held accountable to our community.
Do you support the plan with the mental health professionals on the 911 calls?
Yes, the program is called CAHOOTS, Crisis Assistance Out on the Streets, $1.5 million. They're working with STRAC, who I've worked with before, to bring this. It's definitely needed, but it also needs to start at the call taker level. That call taker needs to decide how to process that call correctly to send the appropriate resources. So yes, I definitely support that program.
We're having this conversation, this debate in a year where there's been a long talk nationwide, worldwide, about criminal justice reform. What are your views on criminal justice reform?
I think that in order to, we need to start at a lower level. We need to keep kids out of the system in the first place. And some of the programs that we had growing up, such as SANYO, a San Antonio Neighborhood Youth Organization, distributive education, vocational office education, we had trade school training. I think this would go a long ways to keep these kids out of the system in the first place. And that's where we need to start.
What do you think about criminal justice reform, and what ideas would you bring to the commissioners?
So a big part of my campaigning, as I've met with people in the community, has been the unfortunate fact of the school to jail pipeline. So for those who aren't familiar with that, just like in some of our zip codes, there is a school to college pipeline. There's a school to vocational training. There's a school to military pipeline. In some of our zip codes, definitely where I grew up, there is a school to prison pipeline, and that is something that we need to break. In the state of Texas, and also kind of going to talking about the mental health question, the previous question, in the state of Texas, our jails are the #1 providers of mental health services, which is utterly unacceptable. So instead of waiting for people to make a mistake and then throwing them up, locking them up and throwing them in jail, and then thinking, maybe there's a mental health problem, maybe we can do something about this. I really want to partner more with social service organizations to support more social workers and organizations working in conjunction with our schools so we can deal with these issues at an earlier age.
So we are talking in the middle of a pandemic. One of the unfortunate consequences of this pandemic has been evictions. What kind of programs would you support for preventing evictions, especially in a pandemic?
Well, I think what the city and county has been doing, I do have to give them props for working together. This is, I think, the most I've ever seen the city and county working together. So it's very good that they have temporarily done away with evictions. But at the same time, we have to remember that we need to also support the landlords, because all the landlords, it's not like, they don't necessarily own 20 homes. Maybe it's just one person who owns one house. And so we have to have programs that focus on the tenants as well as focus on the landlords, especially if it's a landlord with just a couple of moderate homes. So I think that's something we can do, but it goes back to the community education programming. So partnering with banks to talk about how to save, how to invest, so that if and when we are in circumstances like this, people aren't living paycheck to paycheck, which we know that the majority of Americans do live, but they have some kind of funds to help them get through that.
What is your view about eviction protection for renters and for landlords?
I can't say anything much different than that. I mean, the CARES has provided funds, but again, as Ms. Becky said, we have to have protection from our landlords also, because they have a mortgage to pay. So the CARES and federal funds need to come in and support these people.
All right. Speaking of the COVID funds, in March, the County Commissioners Court approved $5 million in loans and grants to small businesses throughout the county to help from lost revenue from the pandemic. Precinct 1 only got 13% of those funds. Do you think that that's fair? And what do you think Precinct needs to do to get more resources?
We, as elected officials, need to be out in the communities. That's why many of them probably were not aware that the funds were there. As elected officials, it's imperative that we be out in the communities. We cannot be at an office. And this is not a part-time job. For the salary these gentlemen are getting, this is not a part-time job. This is a full-time plus overtime job to be out there in the communities, homeowners associations, surveys. There's so many forms of media now to get the word out, and it's not getting out. So we definitely need to expand on that.
What do you think, Ms. Clayton?
Yeah, so Lift Fund was over that, and when I heard about the low percentage in Precinct 1, I called Jane Barrera, who's over that, and talked to her a little bit about that. And I think part of the problem is that there needs to be a relationship with the elected official and the neighborhood associations, the members of the community themselves. And so I really think that's where it was lacking, because it's up to the county commissioner to get the word out. You can't wait for a pandemic to then build relationships. You can't wait for a pandemic to then start to communicate. So these relationships and levels of communication, we need to have newsletters, email lists for different groups, whether it's neighborhood association presidents or employees or whatever, so that we can get the information out there. Because if we're talking about small businesses, small organizations, a lot of times they don't have the infrastructure and the resources. And some of these funding applications, even though the money's available, it's very daunting when people have to apply for those things. So a lot of times we need to do more than just give them money, but we need to provide other resources.
Shifting topics a little bit, do low-income and other residents in the unincorporated areas of the county receive sufficient services? For example, in Precinct 1, there's no bus service west of Lackland and Medina Training Annex. Should that be addressed? And what about fire and EMS services? Are they fast enough? Are roads maintained sufficiently? How do we expand services to the lower income residents in unincorporated areas?
Yeah, absolutely. The residents outside of the city limits are just as much our residents, especially as a county commissioner. And so one of the things that I'm planning to do is have monthly meetings with the mayors of the 3 towns, Sandy Oaks, Somerset, and Von Army. But of course, there are other unincorporated areas that aren't in one of those, I guess, smaller towns or suburbs, if you will. So that's when it's important to go to neighborhood association meetings. So during my time, I visited over 26 neighborhood association meetings, and if I could get to them more than once, some I got to up to 4 times. So it's really about meeting the needs of that community because, as you know, Precinct 1 is the largest geographic area. So the needs of the rural South outside in the county are very different than the needs of the far west or the far northwest out of the county in Alamo Ranch.
What do you think about unincorporated areas and the services?
I was on a forum with VA Trans last night. It was called Move SA. So I had a question, but they talked too much and only let like 5 people ask questions. So the problem. But one of the questions that I had was how do we make it Move Bear and not just Move SA going forward? Because you're right, we don't have I live in unincorporated Bear County. We don't have those services out there. As far as our ESDs, our emergency service districts, they're moving forward. We're getting EMS units now, and their response times are doing. They're up to standard now. But we need to make sure that all 12 of our ESDs are working together. Also, that one ESD doesn't buy this piece of equipment that's not compatible with this other piece of equipment, and so on. And there was a third part to that question.
The question was about roads being maintained sufficiently.
Oh, so that we need to work on the infrastructure. 211, which is supposed to cut between Potranco and Bandera, just hasn't happened yet.
Understood. Bexar County depends heavily on the hospitality industry, and as we all know, that's been hit pretty hard by the pandemic. It may take a really long time for it to come back, if ever. What policies might the county pursue to help this vital industry and the people that work in it?
We need to open up, but we need to open up with some of the CDC guidelines, you know, the distancing and the face mask. And I can't answer any more on that one because I don't know what else we could do.
What about you, Mrs.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Bexar County depends heavily on the hospitality industry. It's been hit hard by the pandemic. The workers have been hit hard by the pandemic. What can we do to help this industry and the people who work in it?
Yeah, so obviously hospitality is one of the top 3 industries in San Antonio, so it's very important to maintain this. And San Antonio is the biggest tourist area in Texas. So I think we need to subsidize our service workers to make sure when we talk about evictions, when we talk about grants, to make sure that they have the appropriate resources that they need until this continues. And another thing we need to do is make sure that we are maintaining our social distance and using our face coverings, but also encouraging people to support the mom and pop restaurants in their neighborhood and downtown. A lot of the food services downtown have relied on business people going to lunch. And a lot of us, including myself, you know, I'm working from home now. So we're eating at home more. So we really need to encourage to support the industry in San Antonio, that we ourselves need to make sure we take care of all of our precautions and support our local restaurants.
In the recent discussion at Commissioner's Court about the budget, there was an extensive conversation about voting and access to the polls. What are your ideas about improving access to the polls and information about voting to the public?
Access to the polls, yeah, Precinct 1 has been lacking this past year in terms of having the same amount of voter sites as some of the other precincts. And especially in the county area outside of the city on the northwest and west side. And so if we really want to make voting accessible, we need to make sure that there are more voting centers. throughout Precinct 1, the far rural south side as well, has to travel in to do that. So I think we need to make sure that we have relationships with organizations, with schools, to ensure that that happens. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Communicating to the public about information about voting. How do we better do that?
So we need to be out in the community. I am lit dropping hanging door hangers, and I know I've talked to the League of Women Voters, and that's something they're going to do. So I'm really excited about the partnerships that a lot of the Democratic organizations are getting together, which is the coordinated campaign is right now being run by Frankie Gonzalez-Wolf, who happens to be my campaign manager. So I know for a fact she's a really hard worker, and working in conjunction in partnerships to make sure we get the vote out, make sure people know that they can register to vote, especially in the areas who have traditionally have lower voter turnout.
What are your views on improving access to the polls and information about voting to the public?
Unincorporated areas of Bexar County have never had early voting locations, never. Why, I don't know. So we need to get early voting locations in unincorporated areas of the county. We need to spread the word. Our county commissioner and his staff need to get out there, emails, surveys, Facebook, Twitter, and get the word out on when the voting is, who your candidates are, sample ballots and the like, and do a better job of getting the word out as to when voting is, where it's going to happen, and when it's going to happen.
One of the biggest jobs of the county commissioner is to vote on the annual budget. The commissioner's court just did so this week, but if elected, you'll vote on at least 4 budgets likely. What are your 3 priorities for the Bexar County budget?
The 3 priorities: public safety. Public safety. We need to have our sheriff's officers, our BCSO properly staffed, manned. They need to have the right equipment, the right tools and training to do their jobs to keep us safe. I think the other one is to work on property tax relief, especially for our seniors. We just, that's imperative. I've been paying property taxes for over 40 years now, and I've paid off my house, but the house really is still not mine. I just have to pay the property taxes. And the third one would be the work study and preparing the workforce. Again, they need to start at the high school level. Programs that we had access to, trade school programs, and get our kids ready.
Rebecca Clay Flores, what would your 3 budget priorities be?
My priorities are mental health, community economic development, and really putting more funds into social services organizations to combat the school to jail pipeline.
As you're on the campaign trail, you're seeing a lot of the issues that are in Precinct 1, and I'm sure there are many. What do you view as the most pressing issues in Precinct 1?
So, as I've been campaigning, the only promise that I have made is to be present and accessible to my constituents. And I really believe that, based on what my constituents have told me, is that they have really felt neglected for the last 16 years. So we need to be present and accessible, where be in the community, have meetings, have an open door policy where people can call us, we return calls, we return emails, because that's really going to be the only way we get to know what the issues are. Like I said previously, Precinct 1 is the largest geographic area. I think it's the most diverse area. And so the issues are very different from Southtown versus Alamo Ranch versus the far rural side versus Lackland. So having a relationship, having honest dialogue so that we know what the issues are and we can appropriate adequate funds and resources to make sure our community feels supported. At the end of 4 years tenure, it doesn't matter if I can name 100 things that I've done. If the constituents don't feel that their needs have been met, then I would have been a failure.
I see. What do you think the most pressing issues are in Precinct 1?
Well, this is not my first rodeo. I ran 4 years ago against County Commissioner Chico Rodriguez. I ran as an independent. Successful, of course. And since then, I've traveled the district. I still visit sites in unincorporated areas, and I still have family in the south side. So I know the district quite well. But I believe the number one issue is lack of responsiveness and property taxes. Property taxes are driving people out of their homes. We need to work with our state lawmakers in bringing our property taxes down, and we need to be a full-time county commissioner.
This is going to be the last question. We're experiencing enormous population growth. A lot of that population growth is going to occur in the next 25 years within Precinct 1. What are your ideas for dealing with that population growth?
Again, and it's going to happen in the unincorporated areas where I live, because it's already happening out in West Bexar County. I think we've had over 100,000 people since I moved out there 20 years ago. So I've seen the growth. But I think the main issue is going to be transportation. How do we get people from point A to point B? And I know that they've turned it down before, but if we don't start working on a rail system now, we're just going to have clogged highways. So I've been to Denver several times. They have a monorail type system that I think works great. Denver spread out much like San Antonio, and you can safely get and quickly get from point A to point B. Work with our VIA people and get this thing going, because we're going to need it later on.
So according to experts, half of this population growth is going to be new births, children being born to residents who are already here. So it goes back to the importance of supporting social service organizations. We need to make sure that our schools are adequately funded. We need to make sure that our parents have job training so that they can continue to support these families, to make sure we have appropriate health care and education. Of course, half of that and all of that is really going to affect, like Mr. Latta was saying, our transportation. So this has been a rough year because of COVID, but instead of looking at all the horrible things that COVID has caused, I think there's some positive things. And the silver lining of COVID has been that employers have seen that we're not going to be able to go back to the regular, 8 to 5 and everyone driving downtown and finding a place to park. So I'd like to think that in the future, employers are going to be a little bit more flexible in terms of making sure that people can work maybe from home 2 days or carpool or things of that nature.
Rebecca Clay Flores, Democratic nominee, Gabriel Latta, Republican nominee, thank you for joining us at the League of Women Voters. And thank you for joining us for this candidate forum. We want to remind you that full nonpartisan voter information can be found at vote411.org, sponsored by the League of Women Voters, as well as comprehensive voter guides available at San Antonio Public Libraries. Until next time, good night.